Hi, I'm Andy Clark with Trikke Tampa. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to fix a binding bearing in a trike wheel set. I'm going to use an 8.5 inch for demonstration, but it will be the same principle with a T12 wheel set. Alright, so we've got a trike up here on the bench. Now this is our demo trike that we use out in our demo area. I'm using it as an example of the symptoms of what you may see with a binding bearing. So first off, I'm going to show you what a good free spinning bearing would look like. So if I take this left wheel to the T78, you can see how well it spins. Now this trike has been used quite a bit out in our demo area, so it's fairly broken in. Bearings, mainly the ABEC 5s, will actually get a little bit better as they get used because it's freeing up the grease that's inside the bearing, and it just spins a little bit easier. Everything's kind of settled in. So you can see how well this wheel spins. A brand new one out of the box is going to spin fairly close to this, but probably not as loosely. But as you get a little bit of usage on it, it will spin a little bit freer. So what I have done is I have taken an air wheel set out of one of our air mod kits that we sell separately for upgrading a T78 CS to air tires on the back. A lot of people think that their wheel doesn't spin free, so therefore they have bad bearings. Not the case. Most of the time, 99% of the time, it is not the case. The bearings are perfectly fine. But as you can see on this wheel set, it's not spinning very free. Okay, now I have this wheel set tightened up on the frame. If I loosened this wheel axle to where there wasn't pressure on the bearings and the hub spacer in between the bearings inside the wheel, it's going to spin fine. That's because it won't be binding the bearings. So now I've got a loose wheel. You will see it kind of spins, it spins better. Okay, but this axle's not tight. That's not the proper operation. This wheel axle needs to be tight. So you can see I can spin this, but as I tighten it, bam, this comes to a stop. And what's happening is inside this wheel hub right here, there's a spacer that is setting in between the bearings. And that spacer is what the inner race of the bearings, it's what allows the inner race or the bearings to square up whenever you tighten the wheel axle. So the bearings, you've got a wheel spacer in here, and then you've got the bearings setting in here. Whenever you tighten that wheel up, those bearings square up on that spacer. And by design, that spacer is a fraction of an inch longer than the hub in the wheel set or in the rim. That is so that the bearings will square up on each other. However, if those bearings don't square up on each other, it's going to, whenever you tighten that axle down, one of the bearings will cock. If not both of them, they'll just kind of cock just a little bit, fraction of an inch. But it's enough to where that bearing won't spin freely, and that's what binds the wheel up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these bearings out and show you what's causing the problem.
Action.
Okay, now I have taken that wheel off of that T78, and the problem lies in the hub of the wheel set, of the rim. So the way to fix this is we have to take the bearings out. Now I have a punch right here. It's actually a T78 brake axle, an old one. But you need to use something that's fairly small in diameter, but it's blunt, not sharp. You know, I just discourage you from using a screwdriver to do this. So anyway, what we got to do is get something in through this side and down onto the inner race of the inner, or of the bearing on the other side. Okay, now the bearings are compressed really tight against this inner spacer right now. So first off, I'm just going to go in a little ways, and then I'm going to kind of tap that. And what that did is that cocked that spacer out of the way so that I can get this knockout tool down onto the inner race of the opposite bearing. Okay, so I'm down on it, and this is where you need to be careful and use a punch that won't go into the housing of the bearing, because then you will damage the bearing and you will need a new bearing at that point. So what we're doing is going through this bearing down into the other bearing and getting right on that inner race. Okay, and like I said, you want to be careful not to get in on the shielding or the casing of the bearing. Okay, so I've got it in there. I'm on that inner race. Now I'm going to take my hammer and I'm going to tap that. Give it a little, pretty good little whack. It just depends upon how tight it's in there. This one's in there fairly tight. And by the way, I've got a couple of 1x2s underneath this to give me some space between the wheel hub and the workbench. You can see this bearing's already starting to come out a little bit. So what I'm going to do is alternately hit it on one side and the other until it comes out. Be careful on that part. So you can see what the inside of the wheel hub looks like now. Here's the spacer that sets down in there. That's the one that I said is just a fraction of an inch longer by design. And then this is the bearing we took out of the other side. Now to test your bearing with it out of the wheel, you can see this bearing's perfectly fine. Quite honestly, some people actually take the bearings out and they'll actually degrease these and then just put a very light oil back in them to keep them from corroding up, and it makes them spin a lot freer and a lot easier. All right, so I'm inspecting this side, looking in the wheel hub for any debris. Now I'm gonna knock the other bearing out on the opposite side. And I'm just going straight in like this, tap it. I'm just going from one side to the other so that we push it out evenly as possible. There we go. Okay, so we've got that bearing out. All right, here's the problem right here. This is what was causing the problem with this wheel set. So Eddie, if you could zoom in right to here. Is it focused? Everything's clear?
Yep.
All right. So you see this debris right here. This is the culprit. And what happened is this debris, whenever they pressed the bearings into this rim, it actually shaved off some excess paint that was on this rim, or sometimes it'll even pull some aluminum down into it, and that gets up underneath the bearing. And when it does that, it'll cock that bearing just a little bit so that when you do tighten it up on an axle, it'll bind that bearing up to where your wheel won't spin freely. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to use a small screwdriver, and we're going to clean that recess out. And I'm going to try and save this stuff so you can see what it looks like. Comes a piece of it out right there. That right there, and it's kind of thick aluminum, but that's all it takes to cause you problems. All right, so what we want to do is run our screwdriver or a sharp point. You can use a scribe or whatever. So I'm getting a little bit more stuff out of there, and just dig it into that corner so that this is a square corner that bearing can set into without causing any binding. Now you might have to